This is my 55th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 21 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 29th, dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part covers my build of the Metcalfe single-track engine shed card kit, P0332 for the stone version which I built, or P0331 for the same building in brick. With this one I want to start just a bit before the kit itself, as I knew when I bought this kit that I was going to have to modify it just a little in order to comfortably fit it into my Hornby layout. I wanted to put it on one of the spur tracks from the Hornby electric turntable, apart from anything else just to make the yard round the turntable look a bit more interesting. There was really only one track where the shed could go, as seen by the template here, which was printed from the image downloadable from Metcalfe's website. The trouble was I hadn't thought at all about adding a shed when I laid this track down. The track was fixed down with roadbed underneath, and I really didn't want to muck around tearing the track up. But the Metcalfe single-track engine shed was designed to have a workshop at the back, which was not part of the engine shed as such. That is to say, the Metcalfe shed was designed to only have track on the front part with the red line down the middle on the template here. The black line across at the back end of that red line would be a wall separating the shed from the workshop. I didn't want that. I wanted my track to stay as it was, and so to go right through all the way to the back of the workshop area. I downloaded and reviewed the kit instructions before buying the kit. I did consider just omitting the workshop entirely, shortening the building and making good the back wall. But I decided that it would be simpler and produce a better looking result if I just cut away the centre of the wall between the shed and the workshop, allowing the track to pass through. Even with the centre of that wall cut away to allow the track to pass through, the shed wouldn't quite fit with my track and road bed as they were, since I would have to place the building forward enough to clear the platform and the footbridge, and that would mean the very back wall of the building would go over the extended part of my roadbed. Yes, of course, I could have pulled up that roadbed, but it was glued down, and I didn't think it would be easy to pull it up without making a mess, so it seemed simpler to just cut a recess in the bottom of the back wall of the building, so that it could sit over my roadbed. No one would actually see it there anyway, facing the wall at the back of the layout. So, having settled on my intended modifications, I bought the kit from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario, just up the road from where I live. I brought a small scrap piece of roadbed down to the workbench to use as a guide for cutting the recess in the bottom of the back wall. This is Rapido Noise Killer mainline roadbed, nominally 3.5 millimeters in thickness. So finally here is the kit. A fairly hefty package even by Metcalfe standards. Here's the back of the kit packaging. With this one I was able to pry up the flap at the top, so I didn't have to cut the top to open the packaging and get the contents out. And here are the contents unpacked. A little bit unusual for a Metcalfe kit in a couple of respects based on my experience. There are 4 sheets of printed card parts, single not folded, plus 1 extra smaller sheet of the regular printed card. Then there's a sheet of printed pre-cut thin card parts. Then a folded sheet of heavy grey former parts. Then 2 sheets of self-adhesive parts, more on those later. And a smallish sheet of glazing parts, clearly laid out with generous borders. The instructions came in the form of 3 double-sided sheets, single, not folded. Not a format I've encountered before with Metcalfe kits. I still prefer the stapled booklet format they seem to have gone to with their latest kits, but this format was at least unambiguous in order and not too large and awkward to manage, though the booklets are better. The heavy card parts of this kit were not complex. Nevertheless, I penciled the codes for them onto the heavy card based on the key given on the first sheet of instructions. This was the first sheet of printed card parts from which I needed to extract parts, as the SW2 outer side wall parts were the first to be assembled. As usual with Metcalfe kits, the parts were printed clearly separated, and with the lines that needed to be cut to extract the parts clearly labelled, although they do occasionally forget to label a cut line, and sometimes a little bit more cutting is required than just running your knife along the cut line. These are the knife blades that I use. I put a new blade into my knife before starting on this kit, as a sharp knife is definitely your friend. Well, so long as you watch where your fingers are relative to the edge, or should I say where the edge might be. I ended up in hospital getting stitches once after misjudging where a blade might suddenly slip to. These are the first parts to be assembled. The outer side walls and their heavy card backing. I've already removed the blanks from the printed walls. Generally with Metcalfe kits the blanks will just pop out when you press them, but if they resist at all it's best to cut a bit to avoid ragged torn bits. The blanks in the heavy card had clear joins that needed cutting, although this will be an internal part that won't really be seen. I always save pieces of heavy card like those that came from these openings, as they can come in very handy for various things. Now the heavy card parts are glued to the back of the printed outer walls, with the recesses at the top. With long parts like these it takes care to keep all of the edges aligned when gluing. These are the glazing parts and window frames for the side walls. I only take parts out as I need them for assembly, as I'm pretty sure Metcalfe's suggestion of taking all the parts out and putting them into a builder's yard, as they call it, would just confuse me and make the parts more likely to get lost or mixed up. The glazing pieces glue to the back of the window frames. This isn't hard to do, as there's plenty of border. And usually in this kit the card frames pretty much completely hide the outer printed frames on the glazing. Then those window assemblies glue to the back of the walls. There's enough space around them to allow you to line them up with the outside openings. This is actually trickier than gluing the acetate glazing in place, as the glue bites more quickly when gluing card to card, so you don't have a lot of time to adjust the window and get it centered in the opening before the glue stops it moving. These are the inner side walls with their openings cleared. They glue to the inside of the side walls with the notches at the top. The instructions specifically said to put the side walls under heavy books after gluing all the layers together and leave them for a bit for the glue to fully set. This is quite important, as multi-layered assemblies like this will have a tendency to warp, which you really don't want. Generally, Metcalfe avoid warping by gluing walls around formers, but that wouldn't really have been possible with this kit. The instructions also give this fairly dire warning about the need to correct any misalignment of the layers at the end of the side walls. Mine were fairly well lined up, but there was still some tiny misalignment. I didn't actually trim them, as this is tricky for a very tiny amount. I used an emery board to file down the proud sections, making the ends even and smooth. Next, on to the front gable wall, whose parts are seen here. The two heavy card pieces are glued flush together. Then the printed card is glued flush with its folding sections aligned on the inside. Then those folding sections fold around and glue back. The instructions say to take care to ensure that these parts are folded round exactly square, and I did find a little adjustment was needed as the glue set to get them square on both sides. Now we come to the rear gable wall, which is the one I want to mess with because of my own special requirements. Rather than having a solid wall with a small doorway in it, I want the whole centre of the wall to be open to allow the track to pass through. Here are the parts for that wall. I will need to cut out the centre of each of these parts. They're designed to go together like this, with the door on the back printed part showing through the other two parts. So this is the other side as the parts were intended to be assembled. I took the front gable wall as an example and used it to mark the width of an equal opening in the back wall, starting with the shortest parts, as the height of my opening would be limited by the height of this part. I penciled where the sides of the opening would come. Then I marked the top of my opening. I wanted it to be as high as possible, but I needed to leave some of this part at the top for the workshop roof to join to. I cut out my opening in that short back wall part. Then I marked where that part would sit against the next part, which forms the back of the gable. And so I cut out my opening through all three parts. I glued the three parts together and tidied up the edges of my opening with both trimming and filing with an emery board. This is the back gable wall with my opening in it. Since this will be at the back of the inside of the shed, it will hardly be seen, so it isn't necessary to make the opening really prettily finished. These are the parts that will go right along the sides of the building. The instructions refer to them as outer sidewall piers. I didn't need to modify these. First, one of these outer piers is glued to the front gable wall assembly. The gable wall assembly is glued into the corner formed by the short folding section at the front of the pier, taking care to push the end of the gable wall right into the corner and keeping the corner square. Note that I'm working on foam board here to provide a better flat surface. Then the second side pier is glued on the other side of the front gable wall in the same way. Here are the instructions for fixing the side walls in place. Note that they recommend a somewhat convoluted method where the side wall is glued inside the pier, pressed up against the gable wall. Then, after the glue is partially set, the assembly is opened out and the pier and side wall are pressed under a heavy book for a good time to allow them to dry without warping. I did just as the instructions said. First gluing the side wall assembly inside the pier on my flat foam board, with the side wall pressed hard up against the front gable wall. This was held just briefly. Then the assembly was opened out and pressed under books, and left whilst I went away for a while. Here's that first side wall in place after I came back and removed the books. Then the other side wall is done the same way, held in place briefly to start the set, then placed under weights to fully dry. Here's the whole assembly after all of that. Again, this is basically necessary because Metcalfe can't use formers to keep these walls straight, as the interior of the building must be clear. Now, the back gable wall, with my gap in it, is glued in place up against the backs of the side walls. Here's the view from the back showing my gap and the protruding sections that will go around the workshop. These are the parts for the workshop door. The transom above the workshop door needs to be glazed, and as the instructions mention on page 1 when dealing with glazing in general, you will need to trim the glazing part if you want the door to open. I thought I might as well have the door opening, so I marked where the glazing part needed to be trimmed to clear the door. I cut out the marked section of the glazing part and then glued the part to the back of the door. Then that assembly was glued behind the door frame. That whole assembly then glues behind the opening in the protruding wall section, lined up appropriately. Now we're coming to the other parts I need to mess with, the parts for the very back wall, which will need to have a recess in its base to go over my track bed. These are the two main parts for that back wall. I used the piece of roadbed that I brought down to mark where the recess should go. I cut the recess in this first part and checked it with the roadbed through it. Then I cut the recess in the other part, glazed the inner part and glued the two layers together, and again checked with my roadbed going through the assembly. Then that assembly is glued in place, held by the folded round ends of the side walls. I checked the workshop roof in place. It didn't seem to quite fit. With the roof butted up against the ends of the side walls, there was a distinct gap between the top of the roof and the back wall, because the ends of the side piers protruded about 1/16 of an inch beyond the back gable wall. I couldn't see any possible useful reason for this, so I trimmed off those protruding sections of the side piers, making their ends flush with the back of the gable wall. Then I glued the workshop roof in place, now properly meeting up with the back gable wall. I was a wee bit worried about that hole for the workshop chimney, which I hadn't allowed for in my modification plans, but it doesn't appear that it will cause any trouble, as it's right over to the side, clear of my opening. These are the pieces that are designed to glue around the base of the back walls. Since the centre section will glue over the base of the centre back wall, it needs to have the recess for my roadbed cut into it. All the edges were also shaded with a soft pencil. Here are those base wall pieces in place, and I'm checking again with my piece of roadbed. Now on to the self-adhesive parts. Let me be clear, I think these are simply a completely bad idea on Metcalfe's part. What's the point of them? They're not really in any useful sense self-adhesive, as the instructions repeatedly explicitly say. So the fact they have sticky backs is just a nuisance, not helping at all with anything. And they don't look particularly good, especially the dark brown ones, which end up showing ugly white and pale edges and need extensive manual colouring to look acceptable. The laser cut parts found in several Metcalfe kits are way more satisfactory than these. I sincerely hope that Metcalfe have given up the idea of these self-adhesive parts and will stick to using the much superior laser cut parts going forward. Here are the roof trusses from the dark brown sheet of self-adhesive parts, after being peeled off, folded over and glued double. Even when glued, they need to be pressed down and left in order to stick, and they don't look very good, at least I don't think so. I tried to colour the edges, though I'm not really sure I made them better. The part at the back is a regular printed card part for the duct to which the roof trusses will be mounted. The duct slides through the roof trusses, and then they slot into the grooves in the bottom of the duct. The fit is tight, so they really need to be forced into place, but this is good inasmuch as once forced into place they stay firmly even without gluing. Then that assembly glues into the building, with the ends of the roof trusses fitting into the slots in the inner side walls and the ends of the roof trusses up against the outer side walls. The part at the right is for the top of the front gable wall. It fits over the top of the side pillars, completing the facing of this wall. Then barge board spacers from the self-adhesive sheet are glued against the peak of the gable wall. And the same thing at the back, barge board spacers are glued in place at the peak. Now we come to the first part from the other light-coloured self-adhesive sheet. This is the lintel which glues over the main entryway under the barge board spacers. The pale self-adhesive parts don't look too bad, reasonably approximating to sandstone or something similar. This is the main roof part. I shaded all of its edges with a soft pencil. The roof is then glued in place, trying to get it as even as possible. The instructions also say to make sure that the building is square when doing this, though I'm not sure there's much you could do if the building wasn't square at this point. Once the roof is in place, the barge boards can be glued over the spacers. These are dark self-adhesive parts, so I did my best to try to colour their edges, which showed up badly otherwise. Here are the barge boards at the back. There are a bunch more parts on the light-coloured self-adhesive sheet. I penciled the codes on the sheet to keep them straight. The shed vent chimneys are made up using thin card parts. The backs of these parts need to be coloured. Here are those parts. More care is required when cutting parts from the thin card sheet, as your knife isn't guided by the card as it is with the thicker printed card, so it's easy for the knife to go off the line. I coloured the back of those parts with a black marker. Formers for the vent chimneys are made up from grey heavy card parts. For each chimney, 5 heavy card formers are glued into a stack. I'm never entirely satisfied trying to glue these stacks, since they always look off square on one side to me. The tops of the formers are coloured so they won't show inside the chimneys. Then the thin card chimneys are wrapped around the formers and glued. Unfortunately, when you wrap them round, the folds on the corners show up really white. I did my best to try and colour those corner folds. Then the vent chimneys slot into place in the roof. I was wondering what we were going to do for ridge tiles. They were provided as parts on the thin card sheet. The ridge tile parts are cut out, folded and coloured. It's tricky to colour the top folds as it's hard to get colour down into the groove. The ridge tiles are glued in place along the ridge of the roof. The instructions actually say that they may not fit and you might need to trim them, which I thought was a bit odd. Actually, they did fit, although the fit was tight between the chimneys. These are the last heavy card parts, formers for the workshop chimney. All 7 are glued together into a stack. The outside of the workshop chimney comes from the thin card sheet. 2 options are provided, either stone or brick. I went with the stone chimney. The thin card part wraps around the formers and is glued. A chimney pot needs to be rolled from a coloured paper strip cut from the 3rd instruction sheet. The rolled chimney pot is coloured on top with a black marker. There are 3 card parts for the chimney cap. I coloured the edges of the chimney cap parts, glued them together to form a stepped cap, and glued the chimney pot to that cap. The chimney stack slots into the workshop roof and is glued in place. Here's the view through the front at this point. You can see my gap through the back wall, and you can't really see the chimney as it's off to one side. Here's the inside of the building. You can see my gap in the back wall and my recess for the roadbed at the very back, and the chimney is off to the side behind the gap. Little strips of pale self-adhesive material glue under the edges of the workshop roof. First a piece in the middle at the back, and I keep saying self-adhesive in quotation marks because the instructions repeatedly say don't trust the self-adhesion and use glue to put them in place. Then a piece goes on top of that piece right across the back. The chimney cap and pot are glued on top of the chimney. Diagonal pieces of so-called self-adhesive parts are glued under the sides of the workshop roof, and similarly on the other side over the door. Base pieces glue around the bottom sides of the front wall. These little pieces are plinths that are supposed to glue along the bottoms of the side walls, like this, lining up with the wall sections between the recesses. There are light-coloured self-adhesive pieces that go above and below all of the windows as lintels and sills. These are fitted on both sides. A lintel also goes over the workshop door. I put a lintel over the back window, but I didn't see the point of trying to put a sill under it, as the base wall sticks out immediately below this window. These are the thin card parts for the main shed doors. The doors fold double and glue. I shaded the edges as best as I could with a soft pencil. I thought of using brown marker at first, but then I didn't think it would match well as the doors are closer to grey. The timber frames glue to the insides of the doors. These were fiddly parts to work with, being thin card and not very substantial. The doors then glue to the sides of the front opening. You could fit them closed, but then you'd never be able to use the track inside the shed. And here is the shed on the layout. It did fit quite well over my track and road bed. I'm not sure, however, how easy it's going to be to get locos into it, as the opening is rather tight. Anyway, here's a final view over the layout at this point. I don't really have any more substantial building kits to do. There's a pre-built cafe coming that should go beside the station, and I have a lot of detail things for the station, including kits for kiosks and some trackside huts and other small things.